following is an EWTN special presentation.
It's a great honor to be here today. It's also terrifying. It's a terrifying time slot for a speaker. I can safely assume many of you have had coffee. Few of you have had wine. And it's not after lunch, so I can't even count on some of you going to sleep. It's also terrifying to share a stage with Father Spitzer. He listens to every word everyone says. I'm a mother, I'm not used to that. Thank you. So I'd like to start today by telling the story of how religious liberty first impressed itself on me as something that we should all be following. Beginning around 10 years ago, I started corresponding with an English barrister named Paul Diamond. He relayed a series of what were then shocking tales from across the pond, all of them having to do with religious liberty. There was the case of the teacher fired for praying for a sick child, which her managers defined as bullying. Another case involved a Christian health worker who was disciplined for bullying and harassment after asking a coworker if she would like a prayer. The coworker said yes. Still another case of his involved a couple who were denied status as foster parents because they would not recant certain unwanted passages of the Bible. Then there was the delivery driver who lost his job for leaving a crucifix on the dashboard of his company's van. The preschool teacher fired for refusing to read a book about same-sex parents aloud to a 3-year-old. And the street preacher sent to jail for speaking what were called threatening words from the book of Leviticus. I remember listening with real absorption to Paul's stories, and I also remember thinking, too bad for Great Britain. That's what comes of having no constitution. But that was before religious liberty issues became front-page news in the United States. It was before today's legal attacks on Christian charities, like adoption agencies and emergency pregnancy centers. It was before Christian student groups like InterVarsity were getting kicked off campuses. It was before indigent nuns were being threatened with handcuffs and fines. And before many other instances of what Pope Francis himself has called the polite persecution of believers in advanced societies. I'd like to make a case in 2 parts. First, to analyze exactly what unites today's unprecedented attacks on religious liberty. And second, based on that analysis, to offer some thoughts about directions for response and directions for hope. So begin with one sobering fact. During the past 10 years, as reflected at this conference, some of the sharpest observers of our time have come to believe that the tectonic plates beneath Western civilization have shifted momentously. 8 years ago, the late Richard John Newhouse called this new place American Babylon. Today, in his vital new book, Strangers in a Strange Land, Archbishop Chaput invites us to entertain analogy between our time and that of the book of Exodus. Rod Dreher speaks of a Benedict option. George Weigel calls variously for a new great awakening and also for what he has dubbed the Panula option after our great recently deceased friend, Father Arnie Panula, a tireless evangelizer. The deep struggle by so many of us for new imagery and new analogies is further proof that we find ourselves in uncharted water. This morning, I would like to offer a paradigm consistent with those just mentioned, but with particular focus on the ground zero from which today's threats to religious liberty are emanating. That is the sexual revolution. My argument, in part, is that embrace of the revolution has given rise to an increasingly well-developed secularist faith. Now, all of us are conscious of entering what might be called a paganizing time. In this time, Christianity's gravitational pull seems to be diminishing, even as anti-Christian and a-Christian ideas accumulate mass. This paganization, we also know, is especially ascendant among the young. Surveys and polls for years have documented a rise in people who check none of the above when asked for their affiliation. And as of 2017, this group of self-defined nones is the fastest growing group of opinion on religion. So far, so familiar. And yet, in another way, I would argue, this new paganism is not so well understood. According to the dominant paradigm set down by the new atheists and other secular commentators, today's world is divided into two groups: people of religious faith and people of no faith. But this common way of seeing the world is fundamentally mistaken. Human beings are all people of some faith. The question is, what do you put your faith in? What we see as paganization is in fact driven by something deep and new in history: the development of a rival faith, a rival secularist faith which sees Christianity as a competitor to be crushed rather than as a different set of beliefs to be tolerated in an open society. How do we know this is a faith? We know it in part because today's secularist faith behaves in ways that only a faith can. Consider, for example, this snapshot: the scene on the steps of the Supreme Court of the United States on June 27, 2016, following the announcement of the decision in Whole Woman's Health versus Eberstadt. This was a decision about Texas abortion clinics that was taken as a victory by proponents of abortion on demand. All day long after that decision was made public, videos documented the outdoor party that resulted, spilling from the Supreme Court steps on out into the city, a gyrating, weeping, waving, screaming sea of people, mostly women, behaving as if they were in the throes of religious ecstasy. Well, I submit they were in religious ecstasy, their kind of religious ecstasy, in which abortion on demand becomes the Gnostic equivalent of a sacrament. Or consider another snapshot: the so-called Women's March on Washington following the election of Donald Trump. This public demonstration, too, was driven almost entirely by animus against traditional Judeo-Christian teaching, specifically Judeo-Christian moral teaching about sex. The only women's group disinvited from the march was a pro-life group. When forced to choose between women and abortion on demand, the Women's March chose abortion. That's because within this new church of secularism, pro-life women are the equivalent of heretics. A third proof that today's secularism is quasi-religious in nature also concerns abortion. If abortion were truly an exercise of choice, if the rhetoric of the people who defend it matched the reality of what they actually believe, then one would expect its defenders to choose against it sometimes, or to at least acknowledge that as a valid option. But this, to repeat, does not happen. No pro-choice group holds up any examples of women who choose against it. And that tells us something. Abortion for today's secularist believers is not, in fact, a mere choice in the value-free consumerist way that their rhetoric frames it. No, abortion within secularist progressivism has the status of religious ritual. It is sacrosanct. It is a communal rite one through which many people enter the secularist church in the first place. Again, the point is to understand the inner logic of the animus against religious believers today. If all the fury directed at Christianity could be pressed into a single word, and it can, that word would be sex. Christianity today, like Christianity past and Christianity to come, contends with many foes. But its most deadly enemy now is not the stuff of the philosophy common room. It is the sexual revolution and the current absolutist defense of that revolution by its faithful. Almost every challenge we see to religious liberty today is rooted in that fact. Christians aren't threatened with job loss because of writing in self-published books about the biblical teaching against stealing. Military chaplains are not being removed from office and sidelined for quoting from the book of Ruth. No, almost every example of the challenges to religious freedom share a single common denominator. So now let's move on to consider what else we know about this new quasi-religious faith. This substitute religion mimics Christianity itself in unmistakable ways, even fascinating ways. It offers the equivalent of a hagiography, for example, of secular saints, all of them patrons of the sexual revolution. Proselytizers for abortion and contraception, like Margaret Sanger, Gloria Steinem, etc. Planned Parenthood every year confers a series of prizes on pro-abortion journalists, known affectionately as the Maggies, for Margaret Sanger, exactly as if decades of scholarship had not established her moral roots in eugenicism, her faith in the inferiority of certain other groups, and related toxic beliefs. Yet Margaret Sanger remains immune from charges of racism. Why? Because she is the equivalent of a secularist saint of the revolution, and therefore off limits for revision. Similar status and ideological protection is accorded to pseudoscientist Alfred Kinsey, whose fabled research into human sexuality included allowing so-called subjects of his to inflict child sexual abuse. This rival faith also includes the equivalent of foreign missionaries in the form of representatives within progressive charities and international bureaucracies who carry the good word of contraception and abortion to women around the planet. The Gates Foundation, for example, among others, has lately made the provision of contraception around the globe a centerpiece of its work. It hopes thereby to reach 120 million new women by 2020, as its website states. And who exactly are these women? Judging by the photos, they do not hail from Iceland or Denmark. No, the website goes on to explain, quote, less than 20% of the women of sub-Saharan Africa and barely 1/3 of those in South Asia use modern contraceptives, unquote. This preoccupation with the fertility of certain other people, interestingly, is a constant theme in the Church of the New Secularism. Earlier this month, French President Macron also opined that the problem with Africa is that Africans have children. Practically simultaneously, Canada's Development Minister, Marie-Claude Bibeau, called abortion, quote, a tool to end poverty. Now, again, whether secularists themselves understand themselves as people of faith or not, statements like these prove the depths of their unthinking belief. How do we know this? We know it because under any other circumstances, if well-off white people were to proclaim that the solution to the world's problems is to have fewer dark people, public outrage would be the result. And yet, in secular quarters, all of those preceding statements, and many like them, get a pass. This is what happens when your central article of faith is that the sexual revolution is beyond reproach. So the fact that today's so-called culture wars are struggles over opposing faiths helps us to make sense of things that otherwise might seem incoherent. One is the mercilessness that many of today's secular activists show toward Christianity. Contrary to secular liberalism a generation ago, which simply wrote off religious belief as an anthropological artifact of times past, secularism today does not regard the traditional Judeo-Christian moral code as passé. Thanks to evolving doctrine about the revolution, they see it instead as the equivalent of evil. So, one thing we might do for the sake of transparency is to bring those hidden premises out into the open. For example, when people say they hope the church changes its position on marriage or birth control, they are not really talking about one religious faith. What they really mean is that they hope the church will suborn or replace its theology with the theology of the new church of secularism. Likewise, when politicians say they are privately opposed to abortion, even as they vote for policies that will ensure lots more of it, they are also not fully or clearly explaining what they're doing. What they really mean is that they want to enjoy a kind of dual religious citizenship, in which they are Catholic in some circumstances and followers of the Church of Secularism in others. This is a quest that is logically doomed to fail, exactly as one would fail at being simultaneously Muslim and Buddhist. Yet this incoherent claim to dual moral citizenship remains commonplace. In short, today's secularist progressivism is less a political movement than a church. The so-called culture war has not been conducted by people of religious faith on one side and people of no faith on the other. It is instead a contest of competing faiths, one in the good book and the other in the more newly written figurative book of orthodoxy about the sexual revolution. So now that we know all that, what are we to do? The first thing we can do is strive to reclaim a lot of territory out there known as the moral high ground. And the reason we can try to reclaim it is that the immoral fallout of this new church of secularism is more visible all the time. Here are just 3 examples of what I think are especially promising types of terrain. Let's return first to secularism's chronic, self-perceived imperative to interfere with the fertility of other people. This spectacle of white people in increasingly barren societies telling certain other people not to have their own children is intrinsically grotesque. It is also a clear-cut case of how the Christian idea of the intrinsic dignity and worth of all human beings is diametrically opposed to secularism's understanding that some people would be better off not born. We might draw attention to that. We might also draw attention to the irony that a movement known for the slogan, "Keep your rules off my body," has no trouble telling other people, mainly black and brown people, what to do with theirs. All of these moral weaknesses of the new secularism are exactly that, weaknesses. We might also recognize and call out the ways in which this new rival faith has insinuated itself into Christian venues, whether consciously or no. The rival faith tempts people toward disobedience and cafeteria Christianity. It's institutionally destructive. Catholics should not be behaving like political interest groups, each trying to extract a concession for their own faction. The contemporary scramble that we see over doctrine is a powerful example of the sexual revolution's unseen but very real destructive power within the church itself. This brings us to another fact with which to arm ourselves. In a fascinating new book called The Strange Suicide of Europe, British writer Douglas Murray examines the ways in which cultural gatekeepers, including in the English churches, preemptively accommodated and silenced themselves when faced with the sheer force of Islam, radical Islam. We should be aware that there is a parallel temptation, including among Christians, to preemptively accommodate to today's secularist faith, and we should raise awareness of that capitulation wherever it happens. The most insidious threat to Christianity and religious liberty today is not the new secularist church, which at least operates, albeit clumsily, out in the open. The most insidious threat is intimidation to the point of self-censorship. Finally, and most important, we should exploit the fact of all the ruin out there, because the new order of things under the new Church of Secularism is making a lot of people very unhappy and very confused. That's because it is based on a false anthropology that mismeasures humanity and deprives it of redemption. The struggle to find redemption in the Church of the New Secularism accounts for a lot of the incoherence we hear in the culture. And I'd like to draw attention to one particular area where things have become surreal, the campuses and other theaters where the drama of identity is now played out. We need to understand the reality behind that surreality. It has a human face. It has many human faces. Up until the sexual revolution, certain expectations for humanity remained the same throughout the ages. That one would grow up to have children and a family, that one's parents and siblings and extended family would remain one's primal community, etc. The revolution has upended every one of these expectations for many people. It has erased the givenness into which modern people are born. Who am I? Becomes harder to answer if other answers are out of reach, like who is my father, who is my brother, and so on. This erasure of yesterday's givenness is the fact driving the frenzied search for identity today, whether it's in the 71 and counting list of gender identities on Facebook, or the scramble over ethnicity, or the otherwise bizarrely belligerent fights over cultural appropriation. All of these phenomena do seem bizarre if we use the lens of reason and the facts of yesterday's world to interpret them. But if instead we understand that in a world where the family has imploded, where many people don't know the answer to the question, who is your father and what is he like? We can understand some of where the passion of identity politics is coming from. Itinerant erotic leanings and ethnic claims have become substitute answers to that question, who am I? And in many cases, young people experience these as the only answer to that vital question of identity. So in this ongoing catastrophe over the elemental question of who are we, there is great evangelical opportunity. Surely, the size of the damage out there is exactly why we are simultaneously witnessing a budding renaissance of evangelical outreach. It is shocking, but it's true. The overbearing church of secularism, increasingly averse to Christianity itself, is inadvertently sowing the seeds of religious revival. Consider the recent outpouring of urgent work by scholars and writers from all over, some of which you've been hearing about here. That literary response is one measure of a burgeoning counterculture. So is the proliferation of new Catholic associations, which you've also been hearing about. So is the virtual explosion of Catholic groups on campuses and elsewhere, despite fierce secular counterwinds, like the Thomistic Institute, Focus, the Leonine Forum, and other new outposts of sanity and evangelization. These freshly minted organic forms of fellowship will transform the American landscape during the next 100 years in ways unimaginable as yet. And they're all founded on what the Church of the New Secularism can't supply: the authentic account of the human person and the human condition, and the search for transcendence in a world where many people insist there is none. These are all examples of moral jujitsu, of turning the negative energy of the new secularist faith against itself. In sum, the case for hope is that the rival church of secularism shortchanges humanity, and humanity, slow as it may be at times, does show signs of coming around. One final image to meditate on may be this. On June 10th, 1194, a great fire swept through a prominent Romanesque cathedral in a town southwest of Paris. Its loss threatened to devastate people and towns for many miles around and for many generations. There must have been plenty of people then who wanted to give up and declare disaster the winner. But what happened instead was nothing short of miraculous. Those people and their leaders persevered, and in a remarkably short time, a greater and even more magnificent cathedral was raised up in its place. That cathedral is known as Chartres, one of the outstanding examples of Gothic architecture. It was built up by men and women who had witnessed the signature disaster of their times and who refused to resign themselves to it. So too will the church today and tomorrow come to be built stone by some of the people burned in the original fire of the revolution. This is already happening. I met two such witnesses just the other week in the middle of a heat wave in Washington, D.C. They had gotten in touch by email and asked me to meet because they wanted to make a documentary to coincide with the 50th anniversary next year of Humanae Vitae. So finally, having procrastinated beyond all excusability, I went downtown to meet them. The studio where they were shooting turned out to be their hotel room. Their entourage for the shoot included 3 small children. This couple had driven across the country for hundreds of miles just to talk to some people in Washington, D.C., because they were on a mission, as they saw it, to tell the truth. The young woman had grown up without knowing who her father was. She had been raised by a feminist mother who she said taught her to fear and hate men. The young man came from Scandinavia, growing up as secular Scandinavians do. Both of these people, by their own estimations, had escaped from behind enemy lines of the revolution. Somehow they found each other. Somehow, falling in love led them to question a lot of what had happened in their past. Somehow, they encountered a priest. Somehow, they read some books, including some by Ignatius Press. This was their story. And what with one improbable development after another, they ended up converting to Catholicism, determined to share their stories and the truths that they learned the hard way with the rest of the world. That's how the church of the future will be built, stone by stone, picked up from the rubble. So, returning to the question at the opening about what to call this new civilizational turn, here is what I hope is one final friendly amendment. Just as it is correct to speak of post-Christian society, it is also correct to speak of ours as a pre-Christian society, one in which refugees from a rival faith and potential refugees are thick on the ground. In Archbishop Gomez's beautiful address yesterday, he connected our moment to Juan Diego's in Central America almost 500 years ago. Our world, like Diego's, now overflows with human damage. Our world, like his, has now raised up whole generations of men and women subjected to an inhuman account of human life. They are waiting to be reaped, and the more they are, the more they and we will bring to struggles with the new secularist faith in the years ahead. Thank you.